Helen McCrane here again, and today I'm going to be reading to you from the autobiographical book Mama Makes Up Her Mind by the contemporary Southern author Bailey White. You may know Miss White not only from her books, but from her appearances on NPR, National Public Radio. In today's stories, you will meet some of Ms. White's quirky friends and neighbors, of whom she writes not with the darkness and angst of a William Faulkner or a Tennessee Williams, but with true Southern charm and acerbic wit, but most of all, with great love. I hope you enjoy meeting them as much as I have. My mother is old, but she doesn't make up stories that aren't true, and she doesn't see things that aren't there. And that's why we didn't doubt her for a minute when she told us she had seen a flying saucer go over the house early one spring morning. She was lying in her bed on the screen porch when she saw it coming down. She unlatched the door and went out into the yard for a better look. It was round, flat, silent, and surrounded by yellow flames. It hovered over the garden for a minute, then without a sound it was gone. Our dog, who is not the excitable type, barked wildly and ran round and around. Mama called the young man down the road, who is crazed on the subject of extraterrestrial life. Within an hour, the yard was swarming with UFO enthusiasts. One of them set to work with calipers to measure the little cone-shaped holes the armadillos had dug all over the yard during the night. Another took samples of grass, leaves, and dirt and put them into carefully labeled plastic bags. Our wild-eyed neighbor, Darrell, interviewed Mama. Exactly when and how long and what color, what shape, how big? He eyed our dog. Does your dog always sleep that much? Well, he's old. He sleeps a lot, Mama said defensively. But Darrell explained that sometimes, after an encounter of this kind, pets will exhibit strange behaviors. And yourself, he continued, did you notice any unusual depression, dullness of mind, or euphoria after the sighting? No, said Mama. I'm pretty steady for a person my age. And those red spots on your arm. Ant bites. Did you lose any time? He told us that sometimes these spaceships take humans on board. They keep them for a few hours, performing fiendish experiments on them and taking tissue samples and probing all their orifices with nimble fingers. Then they return the humans home. And because of the strange hypnotic state induced by the spacemen, the people have no recollection of the experience. Only their clocks tell them that hours have passed. It's called lost time. Nope, no lost time, Mama said. My coffee was still hot. Well, how about this brown area right under where the saucer descended? The grass everywhere else is green. Well, that's our cover crop this year, brown top millet. The UFO people sighed. Our neighbor's hair seemed calmer than when he first arrived. Mama felt that she had disappointed them. They got into their cars and drove away. But since that day, Mama has read everything she can get her hands on dealing with UFOs and extraterrestrial life. I, not being as thorough a scholar as she, just skimmed for the best parts. The pointy-headed creatures that creep through your house at night and stare at you with their almond eyes as you sleep. And the dreaded men in black who carefully insinuate themselves into your company and ask questions. They're really not men, of course, and they wear the black clothes to disguise the fact that there's nothing inside. A man did come into the yard one day in July, but he was wearing plaid Bermuda shorts and said he was a census taker. Still, said Mama ominously, you can never tell what concessions the men in black might have to make for a South Georgia summer's day. Something about my mother attracts ornithologists. It all started years ago when a couple of them discovered that she had a rare species of woodpecker coming to her bird feeder. They came in the house and sat around the window exclaiming and taking pictures with their big fancy cameras. But long after the little red cockaded woodpeckers had gone to roost in their sticky little holes in the red hearts of our big old pine trees, and the Chuck Will's widows had started to sing their night chorus, the ornithologists were still there. There always seemed to be 3 or 4 of them wandering around our place discussing the body fat of hummingbirds, telling cruel jokes about people who couldn't tell a pileated woodpecker from an ivory bill, and staying for supper. In those days, during the 1950s, the big concern of ornithologists in our area was the wild turkey. They were rare, and the pure strain wild turkeys had begun to interbreed with the farmer's domestic stock. The species was being degraded. It was extinction by dilution, and to the ornithologists it was just as tragic as the more dramatic demise of the passenger pigeon or the Carolina parakeet. One ornithologist had devised a formula to compute the ratio of domestic to pure strain wild turkey in an individual bird by comparing the angle of flight at takeoff and the rate of acceleration. And in those sad days, the turkeys were flying low and slow. It was during that time, the spring when I was 6 years old, that I caught the measles. I had a high fever, and my mother was worried about me, and she kept the house quiet and dark and crept around silently, trying different methods of cooling me down. Even the ornithologists stayed away, but not out of fear of the measles or respect for a household with sickness. The fact was, they had discovered a wild turkey nest. According to the formula, the hen was pure strain wild, not a taint of the sluggish domestic bird in her blood. And the ornithologists were camping in the woods, protecting her nest from predators and taking pictures. One night our phone rang. It was one of the ornithologists. "Does your little girl still have measles?" he asked. "Yes," said my mother. "She's very sick. Her temperature is 102. "I'll be right over," said the ornithologist. In 5 minutes, a whole carload of them arrived. They marched solemnly into the house, carrying a cardboard box. 102, did you say? Where is she? They asked my mother. They crept into my room and set the box down on the bed. I was barely conscious, and when I opened my eyes, their worried faces hovering over me seemed to float out of the darkness like giant glowing eggs. They snatched the covers off me and felt me all over. They consulted in whispers. "He's just right, I'd say. 102. Can't miss if we tuck 'em up close and she lies still." I closed my eyes then, and after a while the ornithologists drifted away, their pale faces bobbing up and down on the black wave of fever. The next morning I was better. For the first time in days I could think. The memory of the ornithologists with their whispered voices and their bony, cool hands was like a dream from another life. But when I pulled down the covers, there, staring up at me with googly eyes and wide mouths, were 16 fuzzy baby turkeys and the cracked chips and caps of 16 brown speckled eggs. Now, I was a sensible child. I gently stretched myself out. The eggshells crackled. The turkey babies fluttered and cheeped and snuggled against me. I laid my aching head back on the pillow and closed my eyes. "The ornithologists," I whispered. "The ornithologists have been here." It seemed the turkey hen had been so disturbed by the elaborate protective measures that had been undertaken in her behalf that she had abandoned her nest on the night the eggs were due to hatch. It was a cold night. The ornithologists, not having an incubator to hand, used their heads and came up with the next best thing. The baby turkeys and I gained our strength together. When I was finally able to get out of bed and feebly creep around the house, the turkeys peeped and cheeped around my ankles, scrambling to keep up with me and tripping over their own big spraddle-toed feet. When I went outside for the first time, the turkeys tumbled after me down the steps and scratched around in the yard while I sat in the sun. Finally, in late summer, the day came when they were ready to fly for the first time as adult birds. The ornithologists gathered. I ran down the hill, and the turkeys ran too. Then, one by one, they took off. They flew high and fast. The ornithologists made V's with their thumbs and forefingers, measuring angles. They consulted their stopwatches and paced off distances. They scribbled in their tiny notebooks. Finally, they looked at each other. They sighed. They smiled. They jumped up and down and hugged each other. 100% pure wild turkey, they said. Nearly 40 years have passed since then. In many ways, the world is a worse place now, but there's a vaccine for measles, and the woods where I live are full of pure wild turkeys. I like to think they are all descendants of those 16 birds I saved from the vigilance of the ornithologists. Early in the summer, our neighbor, an old taxidermist named Luther, came into our house with 2 jars. He had been trying to cook, and he wanted some advice. My mother and I are both good cooks. We have those cool pastry hands and fine-tuned noses and an understanding of sauces. We sat down at the kitchen table, and Luther opened his jars. "I want to ask you if you think these pickles are too limp and this blackberry jam is too sweet." He fished around in the jar and pulled out a pickle. It lay across his fingers like a giant tadpole. Biting into that pickle was like eating a sour oyster with a thin green skin. I scraped it off my hands back into the jar. "Jesus, Luther, do you have to ask?" I said. Mama gave me a look, chewed silently, and said, "Luther, the flavor is very good." "Well, who cares about the flavor with a pickle like that?" I asked. Luther sighed and opened the blackberry jam. We each got a spoon and dipped in. Luther watched us anxiously. I tasted it. I could feel the enamel beginning to slide off my teeth. I rushed over to the sink and washed out my mouth. Mama cut a slice of bread and spread blackberry jam all over it. She ate the whole thing. Beads of sweat broke out on her forehead. "It is a little sweet, Luther," she said, holding the jar up to the sunlight, "but it's got a lovely color." I could see sugar crystals forming on the glass. I screwed the tops tightly back on the jars. Luther slumped in his chair disconsolately and stared down into his lap. "Luther," Mama said with a lilt in her voice. I put my head in my hands. I had heard that lilt before. It is the first sign that Mama is about to tackle an impossible project. Something like teaching a fish to sing, or a cow to dance the schottische. "Luther," she said, "cooking is not like tanning hides." It was her first lesson in teaching Luther how to cook. We watched him shuffle back up the road home with his pickles and his jam. I went to brush my teeth. Mama gave me a good scolding. "How could you say those mean things to that poor man?" she asked. "Did you see that pitiful look in his eyes? He'll probably never try to cook anything again in his life." "Hallelujah," I said. I think it was the pickle that made me feel so mean. "And here you are," said Mama, "a professional first-grade school teacher talking like that. All he needs is a little encouragement and instruction." "All right," I warned. "But remember when you tried to teach that jaybird to fly? That jaybird with one wing shot off?" "That bird did very well," Mama snapped. And she flounced off to the kitchen to gather up her tools to take to Luther's house for his first session. They started with jams and jellies. Mama gently taught him that blackberries are to jelly cooks what polyester leopard skin print fabric is to taxidermists. The very finest jelly, the chinchilla of jellies, comes from mayhaws. Mayhaws are fiendishly tiny, bright red, achingly tart berries that grow wild in southern swamps. You gather them by wading in waist-deep black water and scooping them up with a net. Alligators float by, giving you their sidelong glances and then disappear with a wink. And fat cottonmouth moccasins slither off the muddy banks. Mama and Luther spent one whole Saturday in the swamp gathering mayhaws. Mama came in late at night covered with mosquito bites, but happy. Luther had made 3 jars of mayhaw jelly under her supervision. "Tired?" I asked. "Well, it took some doing to get him off that bag of sugar, but yeah, that jelly will make your mumps sit up and sing," she said. She rubbed calamine lotion on her bites and crawled into bed. "This is all very good," I said. I just hope you don't die of malaria teaching Luther to cook." They went on to pickles and preserves. Mama came home after the first lesson very discouraged. She put one hand on my arm and the other over her mouth. Her eyes were wide with horror. "He was cooking those cucumbers," she whispered. But after a week of work, she was satisfied. She brought me a jar of bread and butter pickles to sample. "Luther made these all by himself," she said with pride. I had to admit they were pretty good. Not too sweet and with a good mustardy bite. "He's developing a nice sense of proportion," Mama said. Biscuits and pastry were hard on her, though. Day after day she came home shaking her head. "A heavy hand," she sighed. "A heavy, heavy hand." But he made up for it when they started bread making. "You should see that man knead," Mama said, picking flour out of her ears. "He says it's a technique he learned in the tanning vats." By the end of July, they had been through sauces and marinades, shellfish, and game. At the beginning of August, I went on my vacation. I sent Mama postcards from Virginia Beach and Cape May, New Jersey. "Wish you were here," they said. She sent me one letter. "Some difficulty with soufflés. On to desserts this week. See you soon." When I got back, it was almost time for my school to begin, and Luther had completed his course. Mama had that peaceful, satisfied look of a person who has done well and knows it. They had planned a graduation dinner. Luther was preparing it all by himself. Of course, I wasn't invited. About 6 p.m., Mama put on her white dress with the little sprigs of flowers. I helped her button it up in the back and watched her head up the road. "I hope you don't come home with ptomaine poisoning," I called after her. The house was still. Summer was almost over. I had a restless, uneasy feeling, a mixture of regret, shame, and sour grapes. I heated a can of soup and ate it at the kitchen table. I hadn't stirred it enough, and I kept coming up on cold lumps. I tried to read, but I couldn't keep my mind on my book. Finally, I went out in the yard. It was dusk. I looked through the woods toward Luther's house and imagined the magnificent loaf of yeast bread with its crusty shoulders, the curried chicken, the twang of ginger in the mango chutneys, and the rosy glow of the mayhaw jelly with its faintly floral note. And I swear I could almost hear those pickles snap.